Good morning, everybody. For those who have just joined us, I just would like to say that we've been studying the text of Shantideva, The Way of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhicharyavatara. And in the last, what we've been doing, we've sort of broken down the text into three sections, according to the traditional way of commentary. The first section was about how to generate a kind of enthusiasm and an understanding for bodhicitta, which is discussed in the first three chapters of this book. And then once the mind of awakening, or bodhicitta, has been engendered in one's mind, Shantideva then talks about the importance of not letting it degenerate, not losing it once it has arisen, given that the mind of enlightenment, the awakening mind or bodhicitta, is itself a fragile thing and can be easily lost if we don't take steps to protect it. Now we're moving on to the third section, which is how to intensify this bodhicitta. This desire and in fact decision to attain enlightenment for the sake of others, in order to place people in the state of perfect and definitive happiness, of enlightenment. One needs to have attained that level oneself. So the Bodhisattva aims to accomplish Buddhahood in order to enable him or her to place beings in the level of enlightenment as well. And I said right at the beginning that this text was originally a kind of private memorandum that apparently Shantideva composed for his own sake, to deepen his own understanding of the path. And due to a rather bizarre set of circumstances, he actually ended up reciting it to the monks of Nalanda, the great monastic university in India. So this third section consists of three chapters, as I said. The first one is the chapter on diligence, or sometimes we could translate it as heroic perseverance anyway. And then there is a chapter on meditative concentration, followed by the so-called wisdom chapter, where Shantideva talks about the doctrine of emptiness as it is presented according to the Madhyamaka tradition. So yesterday we finished discussing the question of patience in the patience chapter. That is to say, the importance of learning how to deal with anger, learning how to deal with enemies and hostile forces, obstacles of every kind. And just to resume, Shantideva says that actually the great enemy of the entire path is the defilement of anger, which can destroy all the benefit and all the qualities that are gained on the Bodhisattva path in an instant. And so it is extremely important to know how to prevent anger from arising. And therefore it's important to know where anger comes from. And he said, you'll remember, he said in brief that it comes from being unhappy, from discontent. And so the question then is how can I preserve my happiness or my contentment even in the face of of conflict, of hostile forces, people who attack me, sufferings of every kind, and so on. And he lays out in this chapter various ways of reflecting in order to kind of diffuse situations of conflict with enemies. We didn't have time to go into that chapter in great detail, but in essence, that's what's being said in that chapter. So now we move on to Heroic Perseverance, or Diligence. In the second version of this translation, we use the word diligence because it is actually the translation of the Tibetan term, sundru, whereas in the earlier version, Heroic Perseverance was actually a translation of the Sanskrit word virya. They come down to the same thing, because as Shantideva defines diligence in the second stanza of chapter 7, he says diligence is a joy in virtuous ways. It means the kind of enthusiasm, interest that one has in the Dharma, that one might have in the Dharma, a kind of pleasure in doing good and helping others in practicing the path. And where there is joy, where there is enthusiasm, there will be diligence. People are naturally inclined to do what they like, basically, what pleases them. So that was Shantideva's definition. And then he talks about how to acquire diligence, and in so doing, he talks about what actually stops it from arising. What are the obstacles for diligence? And he defines them as three. He says there is laziness, an inclination to unwholesomeness, and a sense of self-contempt or defeatism. These are the obstacles to diligence. The feeling that one is, doesn't have the ability, a sort of interest in behavior which is will sooner or later produce suffering, what we would call non-virtue, and laziness, sort of indolence. Actually, I've rather confused the issue here. What he says is the obstacle to diligence is laziness, and laziness is to be divided into an inclination for non-virtue, a sense of defeatism, a taste for idle pleasure, and so on. So actually, laziness, it's quite interesting to see how in the commentarial tradition, as Shantideva says, what laziness is. And actually, it's connected with another Tibetan term called dunzi, which is, dunzi is a kind of desire to be busy. You can't sort of sit still. It's a craving to be entertained all the time. When people think, there's a very nice YouTube teaching of Pema Chodron talking about dunzi, and she mentions when you get on the plane and you suddenly realize you don't have a novel to read, you don't have anything to do, and you kind of panic because what am I going to do? All you have to do is sit there. There's lots of things that you could actually meditate, but one's is constantly occupied in trying to find things to take up your attention, to distract yourself. And actually, this laziness, this desire to, you will find, I'm sure, in your own experience, when you feel that you ought to do your practice, some sitting practice, and you kind of arrange things. But as the moment of the session gets closer, you think of all sorts of things to do rather than actually sit down on the cushion. You want to make a coffee, or you want to sort of feed the dog, or all sorts of things, and slowly the time for a practice kind of gets eaten away. That's laziness. You can be very busy in being lazy. So, an inclination to indolence, an inclination to sleep, an inclination to, laze around, an inclination to non-virtuous things, and this sort of weak-heartedness, a kind of defeatism, a sort of lack of self-worth. So Shantideva then sort of addresses the problem of indolence, laziness. And he says actually the way to deal with this is to generate a sense of urgency. That you don't have a great deal of time, and death will soon be here. There are lots of very kind of eloquent images that you find in the teachings. Like there's this one of the idea that you're sort of sitting on the front porch of your house in the sun, and the mountains are far away in the west. And then as the sun goes to the west, the shadow of the mountains creeps closer and closer very slowly. And then you suddenly realize that the shadow of the mountain is actually there on your porch and you haven't done anything. So one's whole life can be taken up in, planning to practice, or thinking how good it would be if I were, a good meditator and so on. And so Shantideva says, snared by the trapper of defiled emotion, enmeshed and taken in the toils of birth, again you've strayed into the maw of death. What is it? Have you still not understood? You've strayed into the maw of death, the mouth of death. By being born, you are fully qualified to die. You can die as soon as you are born, and it can be at any time afterwards, but in order to die, all you need to have is to be born. And he says, don't you see how one by one death has come for all your kind? And yet you slumber on so soundly, like a buffalo beside its butcher. Like the cows outside the slaughterhouse, or they don't realize what's waiting for them. All they do is sit in this, they lie in the sun, and they're sitting next to the man who's actually going to kill them. All the paths of flight are blocked. The Lord of Death now has you in his sights. How can you take pleasure in your food? How can you delight to rest and sleep? I find that a very kind of frightening image, that the Lord of Death is, it's like somebody who... what Shantideva is doing is trying to make you feel uneasy. Like somebody who's being tracked by a serial killer. And the serial killer is, watching them, trailing them, looking at them through the sights of his rifle, and so on and so forth. I sometimes say to people that the plane that is going to crash on this place in half an hour has already taken off. If when you step out of here on your way home, you might be run over by a car. Maybe they've already set off on their way here to kill you. It could happen at any time. So, as Shantideva says, how can you delight to rest and sleep? So if you really take this on board, this idea, Dunzi will dissolve all by itself. Death will swoop on you so quickly. Gather merit till that moment comes. For even if you then throw off your indolence, what will you do when there is no more time? So, if you attend people on their deathbed, it's very interesting to see the difference between a person who has done practice and has, spent a good deal of their time in helping people. They are much more serene than people who have been busy all the time and have never done any kind of spiritual training. A person like that is always afraid, terrified. Most people die in confusion and fear, whether they're actually killed or whether they're, at the end of a long agony. The only way for us to prevent that happening to ourselves is to, do something about it now while there's still time. And so Shantideva then goes on about, he sort of mentions this sort of lazy attitude of busyness. This I have not done, and this I am only starting, and this I am only halfway through. Then is the sudden coming of the Lord of Death, and oh, the thought, alas, I am finished. Then we come to this passage that Holly was talking about the other day. You look upon the faces of your hopeless friends, their tear-stained cheeks, their red and swollen eyes, for such will be the depths of their distress. And then you'll see the heralds of the deadly Lord. The memory of former sins will torture you. The screams and din of hell will break upon your ears. With very terror you will foul yourself. What will you do in such delirium? If, like living fish that twists and writhes, you are so terrified while still alive, he means while you're thinking about this now, what need to speak of pain unbearable in hells created by past evil deeds? So that's actually the technique. That's what you must do if you find that you can't actually put your behind down on the cushion and do the practice. You have to sort of tell yourself that there isn't much time and you better get on with it. So, the one thing I've been wanting to say on several occasions is that many of the things that Shantideva says are kind of a bit crude, you might find, a bit too strong, a bit kind of medieval or foreign, not sophisticated. But the thing is that it's very important in texts like this, and I think in Buddhist teachings generally, to take things at their face value, not to try to dumb them down or to dilute them by, explanation, sort of new agey explanations. I think it's useful to take Shantideva at his word and actually try to do what he says. So then he talked about inclination to unwholesome actions, and he just gives one stanza about this. And he says, "You turn your back upon the sacred doctrine, supreme joy and boundless source of bliss. Why delight in mere excitement, in distractions that will cause you misery?" So he's contrasting really the teachings of the Dharma on, whatever it might be, precious human life, compassion, refuge, bodhicitta, all the tantric practices that one might learn about, and we sort of leave them. What often happens is that people get very enthusiastic about receiving teachings, about going to see this or that lama, about getting an empowerment and so on, but actually we don't do much about it. You can receive an empowerment, and one empowerment is enough to take you to Buddhahood. But actually what we often do is just collect them, and we don't actually implement the teachings, which is a pity. There's a proverb that a Tibetan proverb which says that the Indians received one empowerment and retained Buddhahood. The Tibetans receive 100 empowerments and don't get anywhere. It's kind of a Tibetan thing, because the Tibetan Dharma is so rich. There's so many lineages, so such a lot of interest and so on, that one tends to get interested but miss the point, in fact. So then Shantideva goes on to talk about defeatism, this feeling that I can't do it. And remember that this is a very common experience, I think, for most of us. You read about these incredible educational programs that they have in the monasteries, and these people sort of learn how to debate for hours and hours, and they memorize huge texts, and they study for years, and they get there, they become Khenpos and Geshes after 25 years of study. Or then you read the stories of the great yogis who go off to the mountains and endure all sorts of hardships and have this incredible diligence, and you feel, that it's completely out of my league. I'll never be able to do anything like that. And the result of that is that you actually don't do anything. You don't do what you're able to do, which is often quite a lot in a given situation. So Shantideva says you mustn't sink into that kind of laziness, of feeling that you can't do it, a sort of kind of disempowerment. So he says, do not be downcast, but marshal all your powers. Make an effort, be the master of yourself. Practice the equality of self and other. Practice the exchange of self and other. This is the first time in the text that he mentions these two practices, which are actually the main practice of relative bodhicitta. He goes into them in much greater detail in the following chapter, but he just mentions them briefly here. And then he goes on, oh, but how could I become enlightened? Don't excuse yourself with such despondency. The Buddha who declares the truth has truly spoken and proclaimed that if they bring forth strength of perseverance, even bees and flies and gnats and grubs will gain supreme enlightenment so hard to find. And if by birth and lineage of humankind I am able to distinguish good from ill, and do not leave aside the Bodhisattva deeds, why should I not attain the state of Buddhahood? So that's something we should also reflect upon and remind ourselves, that we already have a great deal going for us. We have attained this human existence where we are able to, have this kind of intelligence, ability to discern. We have the capacity to receive teachings and implement them. We already have learnt a lot about the Dharma. I mean, all you sitting here, I'm sure you do. You have met qualified teachers. You're living you're free. You're living in a country where you can do what you like. You're not in constant threat of being bombed or murdered, or you're not living in a state of extreme poverty. So you've got many advantages that actually we've got many advantages that even most humans in the world don't have. So we should think of that and think, so many good things have happened to me. All I need to do is try to put the teachings into practice. And it's not so difficult, Shantideva says. He says, of course you may say that I must give away my life and limbs alarms and frightens me. If so you say, hearing the stories of the great bodhisattvas, he says, your terror is misplaced. Confused, you fail to see what's hard and what is easy. For myriads of ages, measureless, uncounted, your body has been cut, impaled, burned, torn, for times past numbering, yet none of this has brought you Buddhahood. There's a nice passage in Pema Chodron's commentary on this text where she says, if austerities were all it needed, if hardships were all that were necessary, we'd be Buddhas already. We've had so much of it. He goes on, the hardships suffered on the path to Buddhahood are limited in their extent, and likened to the pain of an incision made to cure the harms of inward ills. It's an interesting comment. I suppose it indicates that they, in ancient India, they knew something about surgery. And all our doctors cure disease by means of bitter remedies. Likewise, to destroy a vast amount of pain, we should be patient with our little hurts. So, they often say that, when you see these athletes who sort of torture themselves to get in shape and to win their contests and so on, with all the kind of enthusiasm and constancy, they say, the lamas often say, if we practiced like that, we'd have been enlightened long ago. It doesn't even take years of practice, actually, if you meet the right teacher and adopt the right methods. And so he says, and yet our supreme healer does not use, like those doctors, these common remedies. With ways of extreme tenderness, he soothes away intense and boundless sufferings. Our guide instructs us to begin by giving vegetable greens or other little things, and later, step by step, the habit once acquired, we may be able to donate our very flesh. For when we truly feel our bodies are no different from the given herbs, what hardships can there be in giving up, relinquishing our very flesh? So basically he's saying the essence of the Buddha Dharma is gradual training. So step by step, as it says in the vow, the Bodhisattvas who train step by step. He's already mentioned, we saw yesterday, the way in which Buddhism distinguishes mind from body, and how one can adopt an attitude to one's body, which on the one hand is realistic in the sense that it's important to use one's body as a vehicle for the practice, but also you can come to regard it as just a kind of appendage or a piece of property which in the end is no more real than a cabbage or a piece of lettuce that you might give to somebody to eat. Of course, this comes after a long period of training. I meant to tell you that because people have made this remark, if you have something to say, just put your hand up and say it. Please ask questions, because there's an awful lot to get through, and we'll have a kind of period of question and answer at the end. But if something strikes you, then do say. Yeah.
So this is one point that.
Sorry, 1 second.
Thanks. This has been one point that's confused me, is the notion that mind and body are separate, and that mind is the Lord, or however you want to say it, over body. And I don't know if this is more New Age, but it certainly is more contemporary, that mind and body are one and they're not separate.
Yeah, they are one, and they're not separate. But the fact is that as a matter of experience, when you think you can think about your body, right? It's not, and it's your mind that's thinking about it. It's just the teaching. I think here is very pragmatic. It's not a sort of big philosophical statement.
But
when you say yes, of course, that the mind and body are very intimately linked. Yes, indeed they are. But when you sort of reflect about yourself, you do experience a kind of split, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that it's also been named that there's a difference between conceptual body and body-body.
What do you mean?
Well, the body that we experience is often through the mind and through our thoughts.
Yes.
Versus the actuality of the body.
You mean the body as an objective thing outside the mind? Is that what you mean?
Oh, that sounds like tricky kind of territory.
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying sounds like a kind of a sort of therapeutic theory, which, as far as I'm concerned, is fine. But here I'm just talking about this very simple experience of when you sort of think about your body, there is this sort of separation, right? You mean you can actually decide to donate your body to science, or you can, if somebody is really sick, you can give them a kidney. So that which is deciding this is your mind, and what it's doing is doing something to an object, which is your body. Of course, if you look at it another way around, which of course is very important in Buddhism too, that the mind and body are very intimately connected. But the fact is that when death happens, at least from the Buddhist perspective, the body is what is left. The body is what you put in the ground or you burn, whereas the mind stream continues to evolve. That's a Buddhist attitude. Yeah. That's a Buddhist approach, anyway. Yeah.
I mean, I could continue on, but thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You don't agree, I guess. Yeah.
Well, the question remains, I mean, is that to say that the breath that we breathe, that it doesn't exist beyond our thought of it?
Well, that's a difficult question. Yeah, I mean, there are different. It depends who you talk to. There are different Buddhist schools that will say different things to that question. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So, having sort of talked about the training and how it's not as bad as you might think, he then goes on to say that he tries to. Shantideva tends to do, what Shantideva tends to do is to give you a kind of rather difficult message, and then will sort of say all sorts of things to encourage you, to get you sort of, moving along. And so he says that in the case of the body, he said merit is the true cause of the body's ease, while happiness of mind is had through understanding. What can sadden those who have compassion, who remain within samsara for the sake of beings? So he's saying that the body's ease, the fact that one has a certain kind of birth, the fact that one has physical health and strength and so on, is a result of merit, which we talked about before. This kind of positive energy that comes from virtuous practice, positive deeds. And the happiness of one's mind is brought about through wisdom, through understanding. And so he says, what can sadden bodhisattvas, those who are following the bodhisattva path? What can sadden those who have compassion, who remain within samsara for the sake of beings? So this goes back to this idea that for someone who has really trained in bodhicitta, for whom the most important task is to protect beings, to relieve their sufferings, to guide them towards happiness, they themselves become quite indifferent to their own physical condition, in the sense that they're quite prepared to undergo all sorts of hardships in order to enable them to help beings. So there's that wonderful image in an earlier chapter where he says they are like they can plunge into the depths of hell with the same joy that a swan sweeps down on a lotus lake. The question of whether a realized bodhisattva actually feels pain is an interesting one, and I haven't really got a clear answer about that. But what seems to happen is that when somebody gets, has followed that path, they can endure suffering in a quite different way from the way we do. Of course there is pain, but they don't identify with it because they recognize the dreamlike quality of experience, and so their minds remain serene. So there's a story I heard from Ziga Kongshu Rinpoche, who was visited some yogi in the mountains somewhere, great practitioner, and this man was suffering from a terrible disease that affected his legs, and his legs were all ulcerated, and no doubt extremely painful. And so they arrived, and they sort of greeted him, and they said, "Well, how are you?" And he kind of laughed, and he said, "Well, this old body is having a few problems, but actually it's fine. I'm quite happy." He wasn't sort of overwhelmed by his physical condition, and I think that's something that we can also acquire. Maybe not to that extent, but you pain is an interesting phenomenon, actually, when you have it, to sort of work with it and sort of look at it and ask yourself, where is it? A corpse doesn't feel pain. Pain only happens when a mind is present. And so, is the pain in the mind? If it's in the mind, why do I feel it in my leg? And all those, you can also do all sorts of interesting thought experiments. And gradually you can sort of detach. And in fact, I don't know if you do this in America, but in England, they have what they call pain clinics, where they actually specialize in how to manage pain. Because people, you can only do so much with painkillers, and people who have very chronic injuries or terrible back problems and so on, they're in pain almost constantly. And so they, in these kind of clinics, they kind of drop all the sort of medical orthodoxy, and they're ready to try anything, even meditation, they say. So he then says, mounted on the horse of bodhicitta, which puts to flight all mournful weariness, what lucid person could be in despair, proceeding in this way from joy to joy? He's talking about those, the bodhisattvas who take delight in relieving others. The forces that secure the good of beings are aspiration, steadfastness, relinquishment, and joy. So he's now going to talk about these four forces that strengthen one's feeling of diligence. So aspiration grows through fear of suffering and the contemplation of the benefits to be attained. Therefore, leaving everything that is averse to it, I'll labor to increase my diligence through aspiration and self-confidence, relinquishment and joy. He actually repeats the same thing, I suppose, to sort of underline the importance of these four strengths. I don't think there's anything really to say about it, apart from simply to read the text. Again, if you have things to say, don't hesitate to. Yeah, one of the things that Shantideva says is to raise this sort of train in this feeling of steadfastness, this constancy. That not only do you have this inclination and inspiration to follow the path, but you need to cultivate a kind of constancy, a sort of staying power. And often that has to do with being realistic with about your own capacity, and not try to, what I often see happening in Dharma centers is that people, they get a kind of unreal idea about what they're able to do. Like they want to do what the Lama, to be like the Lama, or they want to sort of go off and be like Milarepa or something. And of course, it's too difficult, and so they try, and then they lose heart, and then they drop it. So it's far better to have a kind of low-key attitude to one's own, a realistic but low-key and modest attitude towards what one is able to do, and then do it to try to keep going. So Shantideva uses several kind of images to sort of increase this idea. And it's as it came out, somebody said yesterday, pointed out that something actually that I hadn't noticed, which is amazing because it's actually almost on every page, is that Shantideva has this rather aggressive attitude to his own weaknesses. And the way of the Bodhisattva has quite a lot of images of fighting, being a soldier, being a hero. I won't give up until I see my enemy sort of dead on the ground in front of me. I must be like somebody who drops his sword in a fight. I must get it back as quickly as possible before the defilement harms me, and so on. And it may well be that since he's supposed to have been from a royal caste, the royal caste, he may well have had this kind of, militaristic gene, or he may have had the. Actually, there are stories about him where he went off to be a king's guard and used a wooden sword. But you can find that story in the commentary. And so what he does here is he says it's important to be proud. It's important to have the feeling of self-worth. And he says this kind of pride is not the same as ordinary arrogance, in which you sort of look down on other people and think you're special. He said this pride is a feeling that I can do it, a feeling of inner strength. He said this is a good kind of pride. It's not something you should try to get rid of. Perhaps we would say self-confidence would be a more appropriate word, but still, this kind of feeling of self-worth is an important feature of the path, because it gives you strength, and the path needs strength. So he says, let me first consider my reserves, to start or not to start accordingly. It might be better not to start, but once begun, I should not then withdraw. For if I do such things, the pattern will return in later lives, and sin and pain will grow, and other actions will be left undone, or else will bear a meagre fruit. Action, the afflictions, and ability, 3 things to which my pride should be directed. I will do this, I myself alone. These words define my pride of action. Overpowered by their mind's afflictions, worldly folk are helpless to secure their happiness. Compared with those who wander, since I have received the teachings, I am able. This, therefore, shall be my task. When others give themselves to low behavior, what shall be my stance in their regard? In any case, I'll not be arrogant. My best way is to give up such conceit. So the pride he's talking about is never a kind of attitude of demeaning other people, or thinking that you are better than they are. He says, when they find a dying serpent, even crows behave like soaring eagles. So, of course, a crow wouldn't dare approach a healthy serpent, but if they find a dying one, then they'll come and peck it, because they know it can't retaliate. Therefore, if I'm weak and feeble-hearted, even little faults will strike and injure me. So he's saying here that this kind of self-respect, this kind of feeling of self-worth, is also a protection against the sort of petty things that we might do, the petty remarks of criticizing others, or sneaky, deceitful things that one might do. It's not worthy of us. So this is this feeling is a way of actually protecting us from such things. But if depressed, I give up trying, how can I gain freedom from my abject state? But if I stand my guard with proud resolve, it will be hard for even great faults to attack me. Therefore, with a steadfast heart, I'll get the better of my weaknesses. But if my failings get the other hand, my wish to overcome the triple world is laughable indeed. So, no need to talk about being a bodhisattva if you fall victim to these petty afflictions. He goes on, I will be victor over all, and nothing shall prevail and bring me down. The offspring of the lion, the conqueror, should constantly abide in this self-confidence. Those whom arrogance destroys, he's talking about the bad pride now, are thus defiled. They lack self-confidence. They lack the kind of pride he's talking about. But those who have true confidence escape the foe, while others fall into the power of an evil pride, which he now goes on to describe. When arrogance inflates the mind, it draws it down to states of misery, or ruins happiness should human birth be gained. Thus one is born a slave, dependent for one's sustenance, and so on. So, he goes on and on about this. I will never bow and scrape to my defiled emotions. I will strive to get the better of them. So this, he says, one should have this kind of pride, and one should at the same time develop a strong sense of carefulness, of watchfulness of one's. He says, when the soldier drops his sword, he swiftly takes it up again. So likewise, if the arm of mindfulness is lost, in fear of hell, I'll quickly get it back. And it's important not to let small things remain in the mind, small faults remain in the mind, because just as poison fills the body, borne on the current of the blood, likewise evil, when it finds its chance, will spread and permeate the mind. So even little things, if you neglect them, can become big problems. So, and of course, if you manage to catch the defilement right at the beginning, when it's weak, then it's easier to do something about it. Whereas, when you're completely overwhelmed by aggression or desire or something, it's quite hard to withstand. So this brings to an end Shantideva's reflection on heroic perseverance. Now I think of it, maybe heroic is actually quite an appropriate word, as a title. Shantideva then moves on to the 8th chapter, Meditative Concentration, where he talks about the actual practice. And you remember that when we were talking about bodhicitta, we said that it can be classified in various ways. You can talk about bodhicitta in intention and bodhicitta in engagement. And in the case of bodhicitta in engagement, you can divide it again into relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta being actually wisdom, the wisdom of emptiness, the realization of the nature of the mind, and so on and so forth. And relative bodhicitta is everything on the path that brings one to that state. So all the mind training teachings, all the teachings on compassion, love, and so on, discipline, the vows, all that is part of relative bodhicitta. And in this chapter, Shantideva takes up the two practices that he mentioned just before, the equalization of self and other and the exchange of self and other. And these are actually the quintessence of the practices of relative bodhicitta. And it's quite very arguable that, at least this is what Thubten Chimpa says, as we were looking at it together, Sarah and I, this morning. He says that probably it's with Shantideva that the whole Lojong teachings begin. Of course, in Tibet they really take off with Atisha and the Kadampa tradition, but their roots are here. Or at any rate, this is one place where their roots are. No doubt there are other texts and other teachers, I mean the Buddha himself indeed, which are the origin of the Lojong teachings, which I think are quite familiar to many of you. So this chapter is divided into two main sections. The first section is to do with creating the congenial conditions for meditative concentration, and then a description of the meditation itself. So in this first section, Shantideva talks about the importance of solitude, the importance of practice, and he talks about the obstacles to this, which we have to deal with. So bear in mind, he was a monk in this huge monastery in India. And I guess it's, Tibetan monasteries are very similar. Monasteries for Tibetans are extremely busy places. and extremely noisy. It's quite a shock when you come from the Christian contemplative tradition where, for whole long periods of the day you're not allowed to speak at all, and the whole place is cloaked in silence. Whereas in Tibet, Tibetan monasteries are sort of hive of activity. People are doing all sorts of jobs, and they're sort of screaming at each other and clapping their hands on the debate ground and so on. So Shantideva says, yes, it's important to sort of withdraw from that and to quieten down. And of course, actually, that's probably what he was doing all his life, which was why people didn't like him, because he didn't get involved in the activities of the monastery. So he says that cultivating diligence, as we've just described, in concentration I will place my mind. For those whose minds are slack and wandering, are caught between the fangs of the afflictions. So it's quite easy to be a very busy monk, and at the same time, and even a very learned and studious monk, but at the same time to have a slack mind, a mind that is not being constantly, observed and kept under control by the forces of mindfulness. So if your mind is slack and wandering, it's certain that you are caught in the fangs of the afflictions. The afflictions will certainly arise in an undisciplined mind. You will cause misery for yourself and unhappiness to everyone around you. And he says, in solitude the mind and body are not troubled by distraction. Therefore leave this worldly life and totally abandon mental wandering. Because of loved ones and desire for gain, we fail to turn away from worldly things. These, then, are the first things to renounce. The prudent should conduct themselves like this. Now, this is quite a challenge for us. In the case of Shantideva's monastic community, they had, at least in theory, already renounced family life, right? Loved ones. And in theory, they had renounced desire for gain. Perhaps, I don't think it worked out terribly well in practice, but anyway, that was the idea. And so Shantideva talks about this, and he says if we fail to turn away from worldly things, we won't get anywhere. And so this is actually quite an important thing for us to think about, because we are not monks or nuns. We're not living in a monastery. But as I said, Tibetan monasteries, Indian monasteries are quite busy places, so they're not different from us in the sense that they're idle or, just sitting, meditating all day. On the other hand, we live in families. We have wives and husbands and children, and we have responsibilities. And we are emotionally caught up in those relationships, which is completely natural and anyway unavoidable. So the question is, what do you do with that? How do you cultivate a sense of solitude? This is something for everyone to find out for themselves according to their own possibilities. How to take time off, how to take a few minutes here and there to reflect quietly on the teachings. It's an important aspect of life, and it's not easy to implement, of course. But on the other hand, there's also the question of emotional attachment, and we broached this question earlier when we were talking about equanimity. The 4 mind changes of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. I think we talked about it. And I said, the way we divide the world into 3 sections, and some people are important to us, some are not, and so on. And in other words, what we've done is to divide the world according to our own egocentric attitude. So when you sort of reflect in that way, you can see that your child, your dear baby, your husband, your lover, whatever, at the same time that they are in the moment very important, it's important to remember also that this is a very, very transient situation. They have come from an incalculable series of lives in the past. and so have I, and we've sort of met in this place, like travellers in a railway station or in a hotel, and eventually we will split, we will divide, we will go our different ways. So that's actually a very useful idea, because it throws into perspective the nature of the relationship. You can say, well, we've got together at this moment, let's be happy. Let's not spoil it by being, selfish or aggressive or so on. But at the same time, the teachings are always sort of calling us to kind of step back a little, and to realize that our children are, of course, very special, but they're actually not different from other children. And if you look at them, if you look at the situation from the children's point of view, they are completely the same from their point of view, even though from our egocentric point of view they look very different in terms of importance or not. So that's what Shantideva is basically saying, that we should kind of withdraw. And if one can do that in a, if one has the capacity to take monastic vows, if one has that and cultivate genuine renunciation, then that is a very wonderful thing. But if we haven't got that interest or capacity or possibility, there are plenty of other ways to follow the path. And the Bodhisattva is not automatically a monastic. Especially in the Nyingma tradition, the greatest lamas have all been married in our modern age. I mean, not all, but quite a lot. Sakya Trinzin is a married man, and so on. Anyway, he then goes on to talk about the problem of craving, wanting to search for a partner, and craving for a partner, craving for a lover, and which is felt as much by monks as by any other men, or by as much by nuns as any other women. So he goes into this long sort of description. And I think actually he's doing it as a kind of joke. It's sort of light-hearted when he talks about all the complicated arrangements in ancient India for finding a wife, and the wealth you have to accumulate, and poor men, they'd spend their whole time trying to get enough money in order to marry. By the time they've got enough, they're too old, and so on and so forth. And you're completely besotted with the body of this lover. How come you're not still interested when it's lying in the charnel ground and being eaten by the crows and the jackals? It's perfectly true that we love our partners or our parents or our children, but if they died, you wouldn't have them in the house for 24 hours. It's worth thinking about, right? So he says similar things about property, how property, is all going to be given up anyway. There are no, as they say in Lancashire where I come from, there are no pockets in shrouds. You can't take it with you. So property, that puts in perspective all the amount of time that we spend accumulating riches and so on. Then, having sort of talked about the conditions congenial to concentration, he then talks about, and we don't really have time, I'm afraid, to go into this in great detail, but he talks about the equality of self and other, and the exchange of self and other. Let me just find yes, it's... And this is also another a difficult, a rather novel, strange idea to begin with for us. So once again, it's worth thinking about it carefully and taking it seriously. He says, strive at first to meditate upon the sameness of yourself and others. In joy and sorrow, all are equal. Thus be guardian of all as of yourself. In joy and sorrow, he's talking about the experiences. in joy and sorrow, we are all the same. Everybody wants to be happy. Nobody wants to suffer. There's a kind of, as they say in Tibetan, beings have the same taste. We are all the same. And then he says, the hand and other limbs are many and distinct, but all are one, the body to be kept and guarded. Likewise, different beings in their joys and sorrows are, like me, all one in wanting happiness. So it's because we are all the same, it's as if we are all members of a single body, right? Just as our hands and feet are members of our body, right? And then he says, interestingly, this pain of mine does not afflict or cause discomfort to another's body. Yet this pain is hard for me to bear, because I cling and take it for my own. Another being's pain I do not feel, and yet because I take them for myself, their suffering is mine and therefore hard to bear. So what he's saying is that a bit like the old yogi who had the ulcers on his legs, he didn't sort of take the pain as his own. It wasn't part of his self-identification. He'd managed to separate, the body from his mind in a way. And so, but in our case, when we get sick, when we get a headache, backache, and so on, we really kind of fall into it, and we become miserable. Our minds become miserable because of the pain of our bodies, right? We are completely overwhelmed by it, and we're overwhelmed by it because we've identified this body, this limb, this sore, this injury with ourselves. And the reason why we don't feel the pain of others, we're not sensitive to the pain of others, is that we can't cling to it in the same way, or we don't cling to it in the same way that we cling to this pain here. But on the other hand, he says, if I were able to do so, because I take them for myself, their suffering is mine, and therefore hard to bear. So it seems to me that there is a kind of a sort of range of degrees in which this happens. So right from now, one can say, following the argument, that insofar as beings become important to me, through the practice of the mind training or, Shantadeva's teaching, to the extent that they become important to me, I am concerned with their pain. And to the extent that I can actually sort of welcome them in to my own feeling of being a self, to that extent, I will feel their pain. So, in the commentary of Khenpo Kumpel, he says that a mother who has a baby, and the baby is in great distress and ill, the mother suffers because she identifies so closely with the baby. It's almost as if she's feeling the pain of the child. She suffers along with the child. It's like the child's suffering is her suffering, and she will do anything to remove it, right? So to the extent that we can sort of identify with beings, and to that extent we will be eager to do something to remove their pain. I mean, on a very kind of mundane level, I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but if you buy a new car, and it's there, wonderful, and somebody comes and scratches the paint, it's almost like they sort of scratched you, because the car is actually part of your ego identification. It's so precious to you. So, I mean, Khenpo Kumpel says the same, but in terms of a horse, He says if when you're dealing horse dealing and you're selling your horse, until the time that you actually sell it, you're concerned about whether it's hungry, whether it's well, whether it's tired. But as soon as the transaction takes place, all those concerns go from you to the buyer. From the point of view of the horse, of course, there's no difference. Right. So he says, therefore I'll dispel the pain of others, for it is simply pain, just like my own. and others I will aid and benefit, for they are living beings like my body. Since I and other beings both, in wanting happiness, are equal and alike, what difference is there to distinguish us, that I should strive to have my bliss alone? Since I and other beings both, in fleeing suffering, are indeed alike, what difference is there to distinguish us, that I should save myself and not the others? And then he goes on to say, to use a quite interesting, I find it quite interesting, you may find it fairly far-fetched. He says that since the pain of others does no harm to me, I do not shield myself from it. This is a kind of this is a sort of objection being made to him. Someone's saying to him, I don't feel other people's pain, so why should I be concerned? Why should I try to get rid of it? It's not my pain, right? And so he said, and the answer to this is, so why to guard against my future pain, which does no harm to this, my present me, right? To think that I will, yes, so let's deal with this first. So basically, this idea, this argument is based in the Buddhist understanding of what a person is, what a continuum is, right? And on the correct understanding of impermanence, right? So when you're getting teachings on impermanence, one hears about what's known as gross impermanence or coarse impermanence and subtle impermanence. And gross impermanence is what happens when you take a cup and smash it. That's gross impermanence. The cup ceases to exist, right? Now the question is, how is it possible for a cup to move from existence into non-existence? And according to the Buddhist way of looking at it, it's because the cup is not a stable, individual, unchanging entity. It is actually, because the Buddhists have this idea of atomic, they have a sort of atomic theory that you can divide the cup into smaller and smaller particles. And you can divide the life of a cup into smaller and smaller instants. And so they say, if you, even in a finger snap, you would say that's a very short moment. But if you have a kind of a pile of 100 lotus leaves, and you hammer a nail through it, in a single moment, it's done. But the fact that you've got 100 lotus leaves that the nail has gone through shows that moment can be divided into 100 parts, and so on till you get down to what they think of as an indivisible instant. Now, the specificity of the Buddhist view here is that when you observe change in a thing, it's not that there is something that is actually getting older, but at each individual moment, the thing is replaced, one moment by moment, according to the subtle impermanence. You know, the cup is there one moment, and it's replaced by a second cup in the next moment, and we think of it as being a single cup because it happens so quickly. But or for instance, when you see somebody gets a firebrand and they whirl it round in the air, and it looks like a solid circle, but in fact it's just points of light going round, and we don't see the points of light because our senses are not that quick, so we don't notice the change. So the thing is that the difference between you've heard of the extremes of permanence and annihilation, I suppose, when you're talking about Madhyamaka or wisdom and so on, Nagarjuna. And he says that actually to think that something completely ceases to exist is one extreme. To think that something continues to exist from one moment to the next is the view of permanence. So, to cut a long story short, whereas we tend to think, and the Hindus think, that there is an individual self that passes through life, from one moment to the next. According to the Buddhist view, there isn't an individual unchanging substance that passes through time, but rather there are individual instants that are constantly being replaced. Right? So in other words, you get a continuity, apparent continuity in a phenomenon without actually something passing from one moment to the next. The fact that we see it as a continuum is just because we don't notice. We're not quick enough to notice. So when you talk about rebirth, or when you talk about myself sometime in the future, according to this view, it's not that you yourself have passed from this moment into the next moment, or from this life to the next life, but there is a constant replacement, a constant continuum which continues into the future. So although there is obviously a connection, the future you is not the present you, or present me. And Shantideva is saying that future me is as alien from my present me as the guy next to me in the present moment. So it's true, this is answer to the objection. Why should I bother about the suffering of others when it's not my suffering? At the same time, I'm bothered about my future suffering, but it's not my present suffering. It's an interesting idea. And so, yeah. Anyway, you get the message, I guess. So he's saying that that's not an argument to say that I'm not concerned about this other person's suffering. I'm only concerned about my future suffering because your future suffering is just as alien to you now as this other guy's. And so he will come back to his main point, that suffering has no possessor. Therefore, no distinctions can be made. Pain is just pain, right? We are all suffering it. And therefore, to sort of compartmentalize it into your suffering, my suffering, is like taking space and trying to cut it with a pair of scissors. So this is, yeah?
Isn't there a bit of a paradox there, though, as you mentioned earlier, how in order...
I can slow down. No. Is there not a bit of a paradox there? Not being able to separate one's pain and others' pain, and the teaching that you said earlier, which is that, in fact, if one wants to become a bodhisattva, one cannot actually take away the pains of others unless one has become essentially a Buddha oneself.
Yeah, in a way, I think there is a paradox. I think that ultimately what you say is true, but in the meantime, you sort of approach this practice from two sides. On the one hand, you can look at it from the ultimate bodhicitta point of view, and or rather the ultimate goal, point of view of the ultimate goal, where you strive to attain enlightenment so that you are skillful in order to help others. But you don't wait until you're enlightened before you start. You can start right now, and actually what you're doing now is contributing to the path. So in a way it's a paradox, but at the same time, I think, is that what you're talking about? No.
It feels very simple when you say that, and I'm so yeah. I think that's all.
Okay. So he says, there are people who think, well, this kind of practice, this feeling of compassion, this feeling of concern for others, is so disturbing. It causes me such pain. I'm actually increasing pain by being compassionate. And so Shantideva says, well, come off it. This is only a small thing compared with the suffering of all beings. And you can put up with this little discomfort of your compassion in order to remove the sufferings of everyone. And he says, the ocean-like immensity of joy arising when all beings will be freed. Will this be not enough? Will this not satisfy? The wish for my own freedom, what is that to me? Well, there's a lot more to say, but I think we'd probably better move on. Does anybody have more to ask? Or, this 8th chapter is a wonderful chapter, and it's worth reading many times. Even though what you've got to get over the thing about how ugly the impurity of the woman's body is. Once you've got over that bit, and put it into proper context, then the rest of the chapter is really marvelous. So we should now move on to, because we're going to finish at 12, and we need to have some time for questions and discussion. So we should now move on to the 9th chapter on wisdom. It's good. Give me a chance to find my papers.
This is really not worth recording. Maybe I missed it because I came in late, but so we're going to do the 9th chapter this morning. This afternoon we're going to continue with the 9th chapter.
No, we're going to talk about
applications in modern world and everyday life.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
we're going to listen to Judy mainly.
What's that?
We're going to listen to Judy mainly.
So
we're kind of finishing the text this morning.
So the 9th chapter.
We're going to do it now.
Is going to get short shrift, pretty much.
Yeah, well, actually, a bit longer than the last chapter. But
okay.
So.
Thanks.
So this chapter has a terrible reputation. Everybody says this. This is the most difficult, obscure part, and in a way, it's true. It's Shantideva talking about the wisdom of emptiness, and he's kind of he's expounding the view of the middle way, Nagarjuna's middle way, the Madhyamaka. And Madhyamaka is a very profound subject. It's very difficult to penetrate. In order to get anywhere with it, it's also a very fascinating subject, by the way, you need a competent teacher, a skilled teacher, and you need to study a long time. You need a lot of merit to understand Madhyamaka. And you need a lot of hard work and commitment, a lot of mental work, if you want to study Madhyamaka, right? So when in talking about the teachings on emptiness, like they all say, Mipan Rinpoche says that there are two approaches. There is the approach of the Panditas, and there is the approach of the yogis. And the approach of the yogis is those who follow the instructions of their teacher, and they immediately go into meditation. And the point is that the teacher actually guides the student into what is in fact the heart of Madhyamaka, points out the nature of the mind, gives instructions on to meditate, and then the person goes off and meditates, which might strike you as being rather easy. But in fact, there is, you think of Madhyamaka as being all these incredible, obscure arguments. But in fact, when in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, when the teacher sort of gives these instructions, you have to spend months and months and years of meditation actually working, doing the kind of things that Nagarjuna's text, or Shantideva's text, is doing in a different way. So it's not necessarily an easy option, the way of the yogis. But it is a question of temperament and inclination. Some people are inclined to that, and that's their path. Other people need to think, need to reflect, and you can't pretend to be what you're not. There's an interesting excuse me. There's an interesting passage in Dudjom Rinpoche's commentary on the Three Vows, where he talks about Dzogchen, and he says Dzogchen works very well for people who are with extremely sharp faculties, or for idiots. For those who are in between, it's very difficult, because they have to go through all the different sort of, different kinds of trainings and teachings. And by idiot, he meant someone who has very little kind of mental complexity, who has implicit trust, unquestioning trust in the teacher. And therefore the teacher can kind of do something with that person. There's this story of Khyentse Rinpoche who, Dingha Khyentse Rinpoche had this old servant who was totally useless and, was messy and dirty and inefficient. And it was the last time that Rinpoche went back to Bhutan just before he died. And this old guy was had retired in this this little shack in Punsoling. And to everybody's surprise, he stopped and went to see him. And he went into his room, and they stayed together for quite some time. And then he left and went on to Paro, where he later died. And so it was his daughter, it was Khyentse Rinpoche's daughter, that told me this story. And she said, they're Tibetan, so they have this kind of feeling of responsibility to their retainers. And so she felt, she should look after him. And she heard that he'd died, they'd found him dead. And so she went to the place and she sort of organized the funeral, and there he was sitting up in bed. And so they put the body in a box and they took it up to Paro. And by the time they got to Paro, it had shrunk, meaning that he'd gained a kind of rainbow body. In other words, he'd gained accomplishment thanks to Khyentse Rinpoche's guidance. So that it's quite, for someone like that, it works very well. But for the large majority of people, we need to think. We need to sort of think our way through things. And Madhyamaka, for people like this, can be very useful. Because reasoning is essential. And there is a very interesting passage in Mipem Rinpoche's commentary to the Adornment of the Middle Way, where he says that for practice, for the path to be, in order to follow the path successfully, for practice to be effective, you have to have the correct view. You have to understand the view, the Buddhist view. And as regards to the Buddhist view, you have to have absolute, unwavering conviction in it. He says faith is not enough. You can listen to the Lama, listen to the teachings, and say, yes, of course, I believe it, I accept it. But that's not the same as of the conviction that comes from seeing that it is true. And in order to see that it is true, many people have to reason, you have to use reason. So, that's what, and when you open the Madhyamaka Karakas of Nagarjuna, that's what it is. It's a sort of series of chapters of very subtle, crazy arguments sometimes, where what he does is that he takes all the different categories, I'm having to summarize here because we don't have that much time, all the different categories of experience, even simple things like movement or cause and effect. And he says that all these things, everything works fine, provided you don't look too closely, right? But as soon as you start to analyze, you will find that even the simplest operations of ordinary life are inexplicable. Reason cannot explain what's going on. So, I'll come back to that in a minute. But one thing that has helped me in sort of getting to grips with Madhyamaka, because it has all these different facets, all these different traditions and interpretations and debates and so on. So it's useful to get a kind of clear one idea that gives you a key into what it's all about. And a useful key is a story, I suppose, an event that happened when the Buddha, after the Buddha had attained enlightenment, and he was a teacher, and he was approached by various ascetics or students who wanted to debate with him or talk to him. And there was this particular guy called Vacchagotta, who posed 4 main questions. He said, does the universe have a beginning, or not, or both, or neither? Does the universe have an end, or not, or both, or neither? Does the Buddha exist after death, or not? Is the self identical with the body, or not? In other words, he's asking questions about things that are, by their nature, beyond the range of empirical experience. Which, of course, doesn't usually faze philosophers, because they like to use reasoning to, actually go beyond what is immediately available to the senses, and come up with all sorts of theories about the nature of phenomena or the universe. And to all these questions, the Buddha said nothing. He remained silent. And so this silence of the Buddha has caused a lot of comment, but the general consensus among Buddhists is that his silence was the answer. And he basically said that, why was he silent? And like Vasubandhu, the great master Vasubandhu, talking about the 4th question, whether the self is identical with the body, he said, the problem, the Buddha didn't answer because he couldn't. The question was wrong. He said, since the self is totally inexistent, how could the Buddha have declared whether it was the same or different from the body? It's as if he had asked the Buddha, are the hairs of the tortoise smooth or curly? Tortoises don't have hairs, so you can't say yes or no in answer to this. There's only silence is possible, right? And so, at the end of this conversation, Vacchagotta, disappointed, he asked the Buddha whether he has a theory of his own. He said, "What do you think?" And the Buddha said, "The Tathagata, O Vaccha, is free of all theories. But this does the Tathagata know, the nature of form, how form arises and passes away, the nature of feeling, and so on. Therefore, the Tathagata has attained liberation and is free from attachment, inasmuch as all imaginings, all agitations or false notions concerning a self and anything pertaining to a self have gone, faded, ceased, have been given up, abandoned." So, because the Buddha doesn't immerse himself in intellectual theorizing about phenomena, he's actually able to discern their true nature. He actually sees form, he actually sees feeling and so on, without sort of being clogged by extraneous ideas. And then he says, in another situation, he says, to hold that the world is eternal, or to hold that it is not, or to agree to any other of your propositions, O Vaccha, is the jungle of theorizing, the wilderness of theorizing, accompanied by distress and perturbation. It does not lead to tranquility and peace, to knowledge and the wisdom of nirvana. This is the danger I perceive in these views, which makes me discard them all. And he discards them not because they're right or wrong, but because they are theories. They are stories that are actually irrelevant to the phenomenon itself. And so he says that to say that things are, to say that things exist, or to say that things do not exist, are extremes. But I declare the truth from the middle position. That things are beyond existence and beyond non-existence. As I said before, Nagarjuna actually shows that reason can't actually lay hold of the actual nature of phenomena, even though we would very much like to think so. And so this was the reason actually after the Buddha's enlightenment, and I think I mentioned it earlier, that he said to himself that this what I have discovered is something so subtle that ordinary people are not going to understand, so there's no point in my teaching. And so, as Nagarjuna says in the Karikas, he said, knowing thus how hard it is for feeble minds to sound its depths, the Buddha's heart did utterly draw back from setting forth the doctrine. And it was only at the request of the gods that he agreed to try. And he said at that point, Brahma, the god Brahma, had offered him a golden wheel and said, there are some people in the world who might benefit, so don't leave, don't go off into parinirvana. And he said to him, open to them, those people, are the doors to deathlessness, O Brahma. Let those who have ears throw off their old beliefs. So these old beliefs are all the theories about phenomena that we might entertain. By phenomena, I mean things. When you wake up in the morning, you open your eyes, you're surrounded by things. As you move through life, you're surrounded by relationships. These too are things. These are also phenomena. And this, when the Buddha says, I declare the truth from the middle position, this is Madhyamaka. So right at the end of the Madhyamaka Karikas, Nagarjuna says, I bow down to Gautama, who set forth the doctrine for the destruction of all views, of all theories. He's actually said the same thing. And so what Nagarjuna does throughout this entire book, it's very difficult, incomprehensible book, unless you have a teacher and commentaries and so on. What he's doing is he's using reason to demonstrate the incapacity of reason to lay hold to the nature of phenomena. That doesn't mean to say that there is nothing. All he's saying is that that which is the truth lies beyond the range of ordinary mind, the ordinary mind. And so Chandrakirti says in the Prasanapada, it is like the teaching of Nagarjuna is like somebody who is thirsty and who takes a cup and brings it to his lips. He doesn't drink the cup, he drinks the water. The arguments of Nagarjuna are the cup. What Nagarjuna delivers is this experience, this insight into, by implication, insight into the nature of phenomena. As I say, if you want to follow this path, if you're interested in it, it takes a lot of work just to work through what Nagarjuna says. But gradually you begin to see, you can't doubt it, that what he says is true, and you know it on the basis of reason. You don't know it on the basis of faith, and that gives you an enormous confidence. This is something that Sanso Khyentse said, that studying Madhyamaka is like making for yourself a suit of armor. It gives you a confidence, and even in the faced by all the kind of vicissitudes of life, you remain convinced in this truth. And this is the truth that actually liberates. So he says, yes, he said it's like a suit of armor that you're making for yourself. And Mipam Rinpoche takes up this idea too, and he says that by using these kind of arguments, by understanding Madhyamaka properly, you gain a degree of conviction that is so strong that even if 1,000 Buddhas were to appear and contradict you, you wouldn't believe them. And he said, when you have that degree of conviction, then you are free to follow the paths of Sutra and Tantra because you have grasped their essence. So, although this chapter of wisdom has this bad reputation, nevertheless, it is essentially important and very, very useful. Okay, so when you go through the wisdom chapter, you find that it is divided into two. Khenpo Kunpal, anyway, following the textual outline of Patrul Rinpoche, he divides it into 3 main sections according to the ground, the path, and the fruit. The ground being the basic nature phenomena, the path of coming to realize that nature, and then the fruit, namely the result of that path. How should we do this? Obviously, we can't go through everything, but there are some things. There are at least one thing which I think is important to grasp. And I think actually a way into it is to use a kind of parable that Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche used when he was teaching Chandrakirti. He said, if you're standing next to the bed of somebody who's asleep and they're having a nightmare, you can see them twisting and turning, tossing and turning, crying and groaning in their sleep, and you can see that they're having a nightmare. And now, supposing the person who is standing next to, looking at the person who's sleeping, is a Buddha, and the Buddha can actually see what the person is dreaming about, right? So this person, perhaps he's being chased by a serial killer or something, and he's in a state of terrible panic and fear, right? And for him, the serial killer is reality. The fear is reality. But the Buddha can see that there is no killer. There's nobody chasing him. It's a dream. So the Buddha has 2 possibilities. Either he can take a bucket of water and throw it on the sleeper and wake them up. And but supposing the sleeper is so deeply asleep that that doesn't work. So what the Buddha can do, being a Buddha, is that he can enter into the dream. He can go to the dreamer and then by gradual degrees suggest, it's a dream, you're dreaming, there isn't a killer, there's nobody chasing you, right? Somebody who enters the dream, the Buddha who enters the dream, is what we call a Nirmanakaya, the body of manifestation, right? And it is precisely the role of the Nirmanakaya to suggest, by expounding the doctrine, that phenomena are not as real as they look. You don't have to take them at face value. Now, of course, to dream about a serial killer is quite a simple dream. But our dreams are much more long-lasting. We dream about being a certain person. We dream about being awake. We dream about being asleep. We dream about dreaming. We dream about having this life. We dream about dying. We dream about being reborn. So all the process of samsara is actually this long, protracted dream. This is the basic message of Madhyamaka. One of them, anyway. All the arguments of Nagarjuna, all the arguments of Shantideva, are actually suggestions to the dreamers, namely ourselves, that what we are going through is a dream. So you can really get used to that idea, I suppose, and it will bring a kind of serenity. Like when I think the Karmapa said this, but also Dudjom Rinpoche also said it. That he said that when you die, you don't go anywhere. What happens is that appearances change. It's just like the program's changed. And if we could deal with our experiences in that way, then no matter what life could throw at us, would be manageable. I sometimes think, if I'm I'm going on the plane going back to Europe, and we're over the Atlantic, and suddenly, something happens, and the plane is plunging towards the ocean, and like it happened to that Air France flight, and everybody on board is screaming with terror. A person who has got to that place where they understand that phenomena are empty and appearances, can say, the program's changing, that's all. There's nothing to worry about. But it's because we don't do it that we really do worry. I mean, we worry because we don't see that. So I won't go on anymore. I prepared lots of stuff, but as usual, too much stuff. But so we've got 15 minutes. So if you want to discuss this, I think basically, even if we haven't gone to the details of Shantideva's chapter, if you were to read the commentary of Khenpo Kunpel, it would help you to understand this, the meaning of the wisdom chapter, and appreciate at the end that it is enormously valuable and well worth the effort. It will strengthen your understanding of the Dharma. It will give you great confidence in the face of life's experiences, both life and death. And it will help you to understand all the different arguments that Shantideva has been giving you in the course of the book. Because everything he's been saying about equality, equalizing self and other, exchange of self and other, patience, how to deal with enemies, how to deal with, remember, defiled emotions, not being in the object and the faculty, all these ideas actually come from his Madhyamaka view. And the Madhyamaka view kind of underwrites them all and gives them the strength that they, that will convince you of their truth. So thank you very much. So please, if you have anything to say or questions to have.
Well, Sten, I'd love it if you just could say a little bit about your latest work on Mipam Rinpoche's commentary on this chapter. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so Mipam Rinpoche also wrote a commentary on this chapter, and he wrote it at actually quite a young age. And what was happening was that he revived the view of the old school. That's to say, the Nyingmapas, the Kagyapas, and the Sakyapas. I say old school because Madhyamaka in Tibet had a long and checkered history, and it would be pleasant to say that it had always been serene and peaceful and kind, but it wasn't. It's a story of a certain amount of intolerance, disagreement, academic hatred, political suppression. And so what happened was that after a big turning point, one of the big turning points in the history of Madhyamaka in Tibet was Tsongkhapa, who began following the traditional view, but changed his view on the basis of several visions of Manjusri that he is said to have had. And he sort of elaborated a whole theory of Madhyamaka, which the other schools did not like. And he was attacked in the generation following by various great masters of the Sakya school. And that was fine. But in the generations following, the followers of Tsongkhapa decided that they would suppress the books of the people who had attacked Tsongkhapa, and they took what happened was that after the Mongols established the fifth Dalai Lama as the supreme ruler of Tibet, the Ganden Podrang government came into existence and pursued a policy of suppression. This wasn't actually necessarily with the agreement of the fifth Dalai Lama, but there were many kind of political forces at work, and so the writings of people like Gorampa Sonam Sengye or Shakya Chokden or the eighth Karmapa were sealed. They were either the books were sealed and the blocks. Either the books were destroyed and the blocks were sealed, and the various schools were penalized so that they withered. They couldn't maintain their position. Certainly not in competition with the vast Gelugpa establishments. Now, we have to be careful here because it sounds as if I'm criticizing the Gelugpas, but I'm not really. I'm not criticizing the doctrine of Tsongkhapa, and I'm not criticizing the excellence of the Gelugpa scholars. But the problem is, as the Dalai Lama says, when religion and politics come together, it's a poisonous mixture. So what happened was, going several centuries later, to the 19th century, you had a situation where the older schools, the Nyingma schools, Kagyu and Sakya schools, were kind of demoralized and weakened, and they couldn't study their own texts. There's an amazing story in the life of Deshung Rinpoche, where the Sakyapas, which was itself had a very profound and elaborate scholastic tradition of their own, were deprived of their own traditional texts. They couldn't print them. The writings of Gorampa were circulated in secret in manuscript copies, and it was very hard for scholars to study. And so there's an amazing story of Deshung Rinpoche who actually goes to Sakya, to the library of Sakya, to find that the library is closed and it's guarded by some official. And so he manages to persuade him to let him into the library, and the official shows him the volumes of Gorampa's commentaries, and he says, "You can hold them, but you can't open them." So he gathered the dust from the pages and put it in an envelope and kept that. That was the best he could do. So this was a kind of an awful situation. But actually, what happened in the 19th century was these great masters appeared, like Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo and Jamgon Kongtrul, Patrul Rinpoche, Lodro Wangpo, and they set in motion what was called the Rime movement, the non-sectarian movement, and its purpose was precisely to counteract the negative effects of this political situation. And of course it was actually much easier where they lived, because they were living in Kham, which is thousands of miles away from the political heartland of Tibet. So they had a certain amount of leeway. And so it was what they tried to do in the Rime movement was, above all, to find texts that were in traditions that were in danger of disappearing, to re-edit the texts, to collect them, to encourage people to practice them, to get the king of Dege to sponsor colleges of study, monasteries, and so on. And gradually, the three schools that had been so had stagnated gradually came back to life. And in the process, as like Jamgon Kongtrul says, once you know what these different traditions are saying, you won't be sectarian, because you will see that they are all talking about the same thing eventually. And the great richness of the Tibetan tradition is all there, because there are different approaches, different traditions. And it's a mistake to think that you should only have one tradition. So Mipam Rinpoche took part in this movement, and one of the things he did was to, he was asked by Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo to compose commentaries for the Nyingma Shedras, Nyingma colleges, reviving the Nyingma view on various things. And he said, until now, even the Nyingmapas, they don't even suspect that there is such a thing as a Nyingma tradition on the Sutra tradition. It's been so lost. He said it's become like the painting of a lamp. You know, it looks like a lamp, but it doesn't emit any light. So he said that, and of course there were Nyingma monasteries that continued to exist, had been founded, and because of the sort of political and scholastic hegemony, if you will, of the Gelugpa school, they used Gelugpa textbooks for sutra topics. They didn't really have much choice, and you know the Gelugpa texts were very good. Of course, you know Mipam says that when he was studying as a young man, well, insofar as he studied, he said he didn't study much. He said, when I was reading the Gelugpa texts, I found them very easy to understand. They were very clear. As compared with the Nyingma texts, which seemed to me to be much more difficult. And he said, but I didn't lose my faith in the tradition of the Vijayadaras, of the Nyingma tradition, and for that reason I have come to understand something. And so later on in life, he set about writing these commentaries according to the Nyingma view, in particular the Nyingma explanation of Madhyamaka, which is actually quite interesting because it goes back through to Shantarakshita, who's the founding abbot of Tibetan Buddhism itself. Anyway, he composed this commentary, and he didn't attack the Gelugpas. But he said he expressed the Nyingma view very clearly, in contradistinction to what certain people say, you know, and sort of put it right. And actually, what he was saying, the Nyingma, as far as the general features are concerned, the Nyingma view, the Kagyu view, the Sakya view are very similar. It is actually the tradition that goes back through to the Indian texts. It's true that the Gelugpas rely on the translation of Indian texts, but their inspiration is not so much Indian tradition, but the visions of Tsongkhapa. And so Gorampa, in one of his critiques, he says the Gelugpas have come up with all these ideas that weren't known. They're completely novel. They were unknown in Tibet and unknown in India. It's a completely newfangled thing which we don't go along with. So anyway, so Mipam Rinpoche wrote this commentary, and as you read it, it doesn't seem particularly polemic. It isn't, but it created a storm of protest from the Gelugpas. And so, and the interesting thing is that several Gelugpa lamas wrote refutations of it, and with regard to two of them, Mipam Rinpoche wrote replies. So, in this translation that we've just done, it's Mipam Rinpoche's commentary and also one of his replies. So he was attacked by somebody called Drakar Tulku, who was a geshe from Drepung, and this guy, who's only 23. He sort of speaks with great disdain and, throwaway contempt for this unknown Kampa. And so he produces this critique. And also there's another later Lama from Kumbum who wrote another refutation. And Mipam Rinpoche replied. And actually in the case of the Lama from Kumbum, they made friends. They became close friends. And exchange many letters. And the point that Mipam says, he says, I am the last person to say that Tsongkhapa has brought enormous benefit to the Tibetan people, there's no question. And his texts that he has written are supremely learned and extremely clear. I have no critique against him as a person. And he said, I have always, in any case, nourished the idea that even when great masters say things in a slightly different way from our tradition, that they were speaking according to the needs of their disciples and as a manifestation of their compassion. And therefore no criticism of mine will be forthcoming. But he said what is bad is that when, for instance, I talk about the Nyingma view, they say this low-down wretch is daring to have an opinion which is different from Tsongkhapa and is criticizing Tsongkhapa. And he says this is not true. And he brings out, actually, it's actually very interesting because he writes this critique of in his reply to Jakatuka, he writes a sort of critique of the Gelugpa position, but he says that's okay. We all have to have different people have different needs. What we have to avoid, and this is the essence of the Rime movement, is that you shouldn't scorn or have contempt for somebody who disagrees with you. If somebody disagrees with you, they're not automatically a fool or a scoundrel. He says what we want is the space, respect for everybody to express their opinion and to debate, even if they don't have to agree. And when you think about it, that's very true, because if you look at what the 8th Karmapa says, what Gorampa says about Tsongkhapa's view, in their opinion, he's wrong on a number of important issues, dangerously wrong. And yet, look at the Dalai Lama. He's a Gelugpa. He's completely learned in the Gelugpa position. When he talks about Madhyamaka, you probably won't notice it, but he's actually expanding the Gelugpa position. No one would doubt the holiness or the attainment of the Dalai Lama, and which makes you think, well, in the end, this kind of disagreement over these tiny details doesn't make it that much difference, provided the person, practices sincerely. So the interesting thing about the commentary of Mipham Rinpoche and also his reply, well, the reply in particular, because it's sort of the interest as far as Nyingma scholars are concerned is not that he's sort of disproving Jakatuka, but actually he goes into much more detail about his own view, about the view of the Nyingma. So it's actually quite valuable. Is there anything else you want to know? Yes. It's in the pipeline. It's coming in. Yeah.
Ringo Toko Rinpoche once commented about Madhyamaka that there's so much fear and trepidation about getting into it. It seems so scary. And he says it's completely unnecessary to feel that way. He says, in fact, the best approach to Madhyamaka is to relax your mind.
Yes, it's true.
And it occurred to me that what little iota of Madhyamaka study I've done, when you go into the karikas and you go through them, the only thing that's difficult is one's tendency towards complication. And that once going through them, there's a wonderful sense of kind of release and groundlessness. I was remembering your story about the paratrooper who jumped out of the plane without his parachute, and it reminded me of something that Trungpa Rinpoche once said about Shunyata. He said, the bad news is that you've jumped out of the airplane and that your parachute does not open. The good news is that there's no ground.
Yes.
So I just wanted to comment that there's some aspect, I think, of the fruition of Madhyamaka that one can adopt in going into it in a way that's more relaxed. In the same way, for instance, that one takes the fruition of a compassionate Buddha as the inspiration to engender bodhicitta on the path. Yeah.
Yes. Sure.
And I'd love to hear your view on Gendon Chupel sometime, but maybe another time.
Well, I don't know that much about Gendon Chupel, but it's a very sad story. He was persecuted because actually he diverged from Tsongkhapa's position, and that wasn't politically okay. and he was persecuted for it. Well, not only for that, but also what they thought were his communist leanings. But,
And his lifestyle, perhaps, but
yes, but
But he diverged from Tsongkhapa, using Tsongkhapa to prove that Tsongkhapa had contradictions of his own. So that's the brilliance that I see in when I read him. Yeah.
But then his opponents said, well, yes, but he had this Nyingma sidekick, who actually was the one who wrote it. It wasn't really him, He's just expounding the Nyingma view, so he's infecting the pure Gelugpa view with Nyingma ideas. It's one thing, to go back to what you said about groundlessness. If there had been time, I would have liked to talk about those two stanzas that, at which point Shantideva started to levitate and disappeared. And actually, it's it's the point where he actually is talking about what Nagarjuna calls the Chatuskoti, the four extremes of existence, non-existence, both existence and non-existence, and neither existence nor non-existence. And in these four, he says that phenomena do not exist in any of these four. And when you take a phenomenon and you analyze it, and you establish its non-existence, the next thing you have to do is to establish its non-existence. And when you do that, the mind enters into a sort of condition which is completely free from mental elaboration. And so that at that point you see that the realization of the nature of phenomena is actually the same thing as the realization of the nature of your own mind. That the two completely kind of fuse. And that's that's something that the Gelugpas don't agree with, by the way. But this is a very central point to the older schools. We didn't go into the history of Madhyamaka in India, which is very interesting, but that's maybe for another time. I think you wanted to ask a question, didn't you, about chapter 5? No, but yesterday, didn't you say there was something you wanted to say?
Well, I think the question occurred to me in terms of sequence, which you hinted at, I suppose, to a certain degree of the layout of the text being akin to the Lam Rim sequence. But I was thinking more of in terms of shamatha vipassana, and then, developing the aspiration on the basis of kunche namshe instead of from ordinary mind. Makes much more sense, So I guess my question was to sort of instigate you into talking about the sequence of practices, especially given the context that we've talked about here. So,
well, you'd have to ask a practitioner.
Yes, I have all these practice questions, and I suppose I'm thirsting for that here.
I don't consider myself a teacher of the practice or anything, but that's probably a question you could ask Judy. I've talked enough this morning.
Well, I'm trying to be charitable by saying, within the context of Bodhicharvatara, just what's sitting in front of us in the text, is there anything there to suggest some
in chapter
sequence?
5? Was it?
Perhaps. I guess when you take the text as a whole...
the whole thing is a kind of progressive teaching on, first of all, getting an interest in bodhicitta, protecting it and increasing it, and as it were, exploring what it is. And he says, the importance of shamatha and, renunciation in the generation of shamatha, but also, then the injection of the view, which is vipassana. I know that vipassana has several meanings and different levels of vipassana, but basically it's when when the mind is quietened, as Shantideva says, and later on when when existence and non-existence are absent from before the mind, then there's nothing for the mind to do but rest in perfect peace from concepts free. And that is vipassana, from his point of view, I think. But it's based on, you couldn't hope to do that without having a kind of a quietened mind. And going back to the path of the yogis, that is, if you look at the Siksamnedik of teachings, the calming down of the mind is an essential preliminary before you actually then start to sort of study the mind and the way thoughts arise and disappear and how they are empty in the moment of their arising and so on. Which is actually another way of talking about what we talk about, the two truths, how they coincide in phenomena. That the relative truth is the way phenomena appear. The ultimate truth is the way they are, that is to say, empty of real existence. And how, and Mipam Rinpoche brings this out very clearly, where he says that for ordinary beings, we've spent lives, all our time from beginningless time, we have been engrossed in relative bodhicitta. There's the relative truth, the appearance of things. There's been no even chink of a possibility of seeing beyond that. That doesn't mean to say that phenomena all that time have not been empty, but the two truths have been separated. Emptiness on one side, which is totally unknown, and then the appearance. But gradually, through the teachings and through the realization, the two truths actually coalesce. You see that they are actually, they come together in phenomena. And that's actually quite an important point, because when you come across Madhyamaka and you hear people talking about it, you think it's some sort of weird kind of mysticism or some revelation of some mysterious doctrine that nobody can understand. And in fact, what Madhyamaka Nagarjuna is talking about is just the things of everyday life. It's, that once you understand the nature of phenomena, you are no longer their slave. They lose their power over you. Like the yogi in the plane, who's not fazed by the fact that the plane's going down, I guess.
I really like that one because I'm sitting there on planes often reading MMK and thinking, oh, if I've really got this, and then all of a sudden turbulence and it's all over.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be quite scary, I agree. Yeah, well, we'll be meeting again this afternoon, I think. Do you want to finish now, or to go on? I mean, if there are anybody, if you have anything else to say. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.